Good evening. I'm Brian Webster. I'm with the African American Alumni Association of Case Western Reserve University. It's my pleasure to welcome you all this evening. We really appreciate you taking the time out to be with us. So a little bit about the African American Alumni Association of Case Western Reserve University. It was officially established in October of 2009. And our purpose is to provide support and networking opportunities to African American alumni of CWRU. So we work to provide a forum for the university to recruit students. We foster friendships among everyone connected with Case Western Reserve University. And we sincerely hope that you all and your loved ones are healthy and safe as we go through this pandemic and this weather. I know some of us are in Texas as well, one of our board members. So we are just praying for you, and we hope everyone across the country is staying warm. But before we begin today's program, I want to give a few quick housekeeping notes. I know, we're in this Zoom era. So everyone is muted by default. If not, please mute yourself. Remain muted to limit the background noise, like I said before. And we know that a lot of you have submitted some questions prior, and we hope to get them, throughout the evening after Mr. Bozeman speaks. So if you have any other questions, you could utilize the chat feature on here in Zoom, and we'll do our best to get them answered. We'll be watching so we could get those questions answered. And so that we know who you are, you're welcome to rename yourself if you haven't already. And you could turn on your video if you have that capability, because we would like to see everyone's smiling face in this digital age right now. So it is my pleasure again to welcome you to Touching History, an evening with Clarence Bozeman, and I'm going to introduce Mr. Bozeman. Well, I call him Brother Bozeman. Mr. Bozeman earned his bachelor's degree from Alabama State University in Montgomery, Alabama. He majored in American History and Social Studies. He received his master's degree in Education Administration from Fordham University in New York City, as well as an Educational Specialist degree from Cleveland State University here in Cleveland. He has taken advanced courses in American history, American government at Ashland University in Ashland, Ohio. And he was an NEK fellow at the University of California at Berkeley, where he studied constitutionalism, 2 centuries of freedom under law. Mr. Bozeman was also recently awarded an honorary doctorate degree from Wilberforce University in Wilberforce, Ohio. During his college days at Alabama State University in Montgomery, he was privileged to serve as the first full-time transportation employee for Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. In that capacity, he served as the driver for the family of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Between 1958 and 1960, he transported Dr. King and his wife Coretta on speaking engagements throughout the state of Alabama. On those occasions, he had the opportunity to share in the private thoughts and conversations with Dr. and Ms. King. And these conversations range from aspirations and barriers in the Black community, the Montgomery Bus Boycott, student sit-ins, and the Civil Rights Movement. He's also a proud member of Kappa Alpha Psi Fraternity Incorporated. He's a life member. So that is why I call him Brother Bozeman. And without further ado, I turn the program over to Mr. Clarence Bozeman.
Thank you, Brother Webster. I want to thank Brother Webster for that very kind and gracious introduction. And I want to thank Ms. Vera Hughes and Ms. Crystal Crosby and Mrs. Jones. All have been working together to pull this program together. So I thank you so very much for the invitation. I'm proud and honored that you would have taken the time just to invite me to share my experiences with you. As alumni, as African American alumni from an especially majority white school like Case Western, I know you have endured hardships, but you stayed. I know you were subjected to unwanted and unwarranted indignities, but you stayed, and you stayed through it all. And now your suffering but through your suffering, you have made meaningful contributions to our world, our country, and our state and our city. So Case Western alumni, thank you for your contribution. And as those two great philosophers, Sam and Dave said, but you did what you did, and I thank you. As we celebrate Black History Month, Dr. Carter G. Woodson in 1926 decided that we should honor the achievement of Black African Americans. In 1976, that tribute was extended to Black American History Month in February, which encompasses Frederick Douglass' birthday and the birthday of Lincoln and Washington. I want to zero my thoughts in today on the suffering of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. In a study a few years ago, there was a data that suggested that many African American civil rights icons suffered physically, emotionally, and psychologically from the traumatic experiences of trying to bring justice and equality to our world. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was a stalwart in the civil rights movement. He was born January the 15th, 1929. And had he lived, he would have been 92 years of age. He graduated from Booker T. Washington High School in 1948, became an ordained minister the same year in 1948, graduated from Morehouse College with a BA degree, and Crozier Theological Seminary with a BD, a Bachelor of Divinity. He got his PhD in systemic theology from Boston University. He became pastor of Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in 1954. December 1955, Dr. King led the Montgomery Bus Boycott. January 30th, his house was bombed. And at the same time, 4 churches in Montgomery were bombed on the same night. Dr. King made over 400 speeches and lectures throughout his short life. He spoke at Oberlin, Central State, Wilberforce, Antioch Baptist Church, Olivet, Glenville High School. Dr. King was arrested in October of 1960. He had just moved from Montgomery to Atlanta, had only been in Atlanta for 2 months. He was arrested for driving 25 miles an hour in a 20-mile zone. He was tried and found guilty. And he was sentenced to 4 months in prison at the Reidsville State Prison in Reidsville, Georgia. Dr. King was arrested over 27 times in his lifetime, but this particular sentence was harsh. He was shackled, handcuffed, put in the back of a patrol car at midnight. And they were driving him from Atlanta to Reidsville State Prison on dark roads of Georgia, and he was afraid that they were going to stop and kill him. But when he got to Reidsville, They had a cell prepared for him in solitary confinement. Now, we all have heard about the letter from the Birmingham jail that Dr. King so eloquently had written. But there was another letter that he wrote to his wife while waiting in the holding area at Reidsville prison to be transferred to his cell upstairs. He wrote a letter to Coretta, his wife, and in that letter he said, "Hello, darling. Today I find myself a long way from you and the children. I know this whole experience is very difficult for you to adjust to, especially in your condition of pregnancy. But as I said to you yesterday, this is the cross that we must bear for our freedom of our people. I have the faith to believe that this excessive suffering that is now coming to our family will in some little way serve to make Atlanta a better city, Georgia a better state, and America a better country. Just how, I don't know, but I have the faith to believe that it will. If I am correct, then our suffering is not in vain." And he goes on to write and said, "I understand that everybody, white and colored, can have visitors this coming Sunday. And I hope you can find some way to come down. Also, would you please ask Y.T. Walker to come with you? There are some very urgent things that I need to talk to him about. Please bring the following books to me: Stride Toward Freedom, Paul Tillich's Systematic Theology, Volume 1 and 2, George Buttrick's Parables of Jesus, E.S. Jones' Mahatma Gandhi. Bring me a Bible, please, a dictionary, and my reference dictionary called Increasing Your Word Power. This book is an old book. It's in a red cover, and it may be in the den upstairs in one of my bags. Also bring the following sermons. I want you to find my file and bring me these sermons. What is man? The three dimensions of man, the death of evil. Give my best regards to all the family. Please ask them not to worry about me. I will adjust to whatever comes in terms of pain. I hope to see you Sunday. Eternally yours, Martin. Suffering." Dr. King in 1963 was Time Magazine's Man of the Year. 1964, he won the Nobel Peace Prize. And in 1965, he helped organize the march from Selma to Montgomery. But I remember my freshman year at Alabama State University. And I returned from my class one day, and there was a note on my door that said that the dean wanted to see me. And I had no idea what the dean wanted. So the next morning, the Saturday morning, I went to Dean Wesley's office. And he said, "Do you know why you're here, Mr. Bozeman?" I said, "I have no idea, sir." He said, "I just received a letter from the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, where Dr. King is pastor. And they need a driver for Sunday school to pick up the elderly, the students from Alabama State, and the seniors in the community. And I've chosen you. So I want you to go to the King's residence on tomorrow, Sunday. And Dr. King will give you further instructions." So that Sunday morning, I went to the King's residence, which was only about 3 blocks from Alabama State's campus. Rang the doorbell, and Dr. King came to the door, and when I explained my presence, he invited me in. And he sat me down at a small settee near Mrs. King's piano, and he began to grill me. He said, "Do you have a driver's license?" I said, "Yes, sir." "Do you have a clean driving record?" I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "Are you bondable?" I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "What are your plans after you finish Alabama State? What do you intend to do when you graduate?" Being satisfied with all of my answers, Reverend King told me what he expected of me. He said, "I first want you to be a gentleman at all times. And I want you to be on time and be courteous to all your customers." So that first drive on my Sunday morning, I carried Yolanda and Martin III to Sunday school. I was paid $6 per Sunday. But after I had been driving for a few weeks, my driving duties expanded beyond Sundays. I had the opportunity to drive Mrs. King to visit her family in Marion, Alabama. I met her father, her mother, and her brother, and they were a very strong-knit family. But Reverend King made it clear to me he did not want Mrs. King out after sundown. So on some occasions, I had to stay overnight at her father's and mother's residence. Once I was driving Mrs. King to Mobile, Alabama, to see her brother who was hospitalized there. And I asked her, I said, "Miss King, tell me about the first time that your house was bombed." She looked away, and then she said, "You know, Mr. Bozeman said, my friend Mary Lou Williams and I were sitting in the living room, and we heard a thud on the front porch, an unusual sound. And we began to move in the rear of the house toward the master bedroom. And the moment that she moved, along with her 1-month-old daughter, Yolanda, to the back of the house, the bomb blew right where Mary Lou Williams, Mrs. King, was sitting along with her daughter. And as she was telling me this story, tears welled in her eyes. But she said, "You know, I believe that was God's radar that saved our lives." And I drove Dr. King on many occasions to Tuskegee, Talladega, Selma, Greenville, Alabama, Greensboro, Alabama, and other small cities in and around Montgomery. Reverend King and I talked about religion and civil rights movement. We talked about education. And once we were returning late at night to Montgomery, and he fell asleep, and he began to mumble in his sleep. And I said, "Dr. King, wake up. You're talking in your sleep." He said, "What did I say?" I said, "That's between me and the Lord." But he was tired and he was suffering. He was tired and suffering because of the threats on his life. He was weary because of social and physical stress. I asked him one time, I said, "Dr. King, do you ever get tired?" And he said, "Tired, no. Weary, yes." And he said at one time he was receiving over 30 to 40 different threats on his life every day. He talks about one of these threats in a sermon on August the 27th, 1967, at the Mount Pisgah Baptist Church in Chicago, Illinois. He told about one of these threats, and one night he came into his house around midnight and the telephone rang. And he had been out all day with meetings with the Montgomery Improvement Association. He said he picked up the telephone around midnight, and on the other end was a very nasty voice. It said, "Boy, we're tired of your mess. And if you're not out of town in the next 3 days, we're going to blow your brains out. We're going to blow up your house, and we're going to kill your family." Dr. King says at one time, as I just said, 30 and 40 threatening phone calls per day were par for the course. He said, but this particular phone call disturbed him. And he said he tried to sleep, but he was unable to do so. He got up and warmed some coffee, thinking that the coffee would relieve his anxiety. And he said he looked in on his 1-month-old daughter, Yolanda. Then he looked in on his beautiful wife, Coretta. And he said, over that cup of coffee, he began to pray out loud. He said, "Lord, I'm losing my courage now, suffering." He said, "Lord, I'm getting weak. Lord, I'm getting discouraged. And I don't want to see my constituents to see me weak. I'm losing faith, Lord." And he said over that cup of coffee, he heard this voice of the Holy Spirit. He said, "Martin Luther King, stand up for truth. Stand up for justice. Stand up for righteousness. And Lord, I'll be with you even until the end of the world." I tell you, I've seen the lightning flash. I heard the thunder roll. And I felt the sin breakers dashing, trying to conquer my soul. But I heard the voice of Jesus saying, "Fight on." He promised never to leave me alone. No, never alone. Ladies and gentlemen, at that moment, the civil rights movement in Alabama and America received a positive jolt, a positive psychological jolt. And it's evident today because Dr. King was on the verge of depression. And Dr. King's favorite gospel hymn was, "Precious Lord, take my hand, lead me on, let me stand. I'm tired and I'm weak and I'm worn. Through the storm and through the night, lead me on through the night. Take my hand, precious Lord, and lead me home." Dr. King said in many sermons that song depicts his life. That song, "Precious Lord," was God's mission to his life. So, if you examine any of Dr. and all of Dr. King's writings, his sermons, his books, you will find 4 dominant themes: love, hope, forgiveness, and prophecy. But I'm reminded of Dr. King's last sermon on earth, suffering. On April the 3rd, 1968, at the Mason Temple Church of God in Christ in Memphis, Tennessee. Dr. King stood before the common people of Memphis. And he said that several years ago, he was in New York City, autographing his first book. And a Black woman came up to him, a demented Black woman, and said, "Are you Martin Luther King Jr.?" He said, "Yes." And the next thing he said he knew, Miss Izola Curry had stabbed him with a letter opener. He was rushed to Harlem Hospital. And it came out the next day in the New York Times that the tip of that blade was pressing his aorta. And that's the main artery of the body. And once that's punctured, you drown in your own blood. And that becomes the end of you. So in the New York Times, in the same article, it said that if he had sneezed, he would have died. He said he had received many letters. He received letters from the president and the vice president, but he doesn't remember what those letters were. He received a letter from the governor of New York, but he doesn't remember that letter. But he said it's one particular letter that he will never forget. And that letter came from a little girl who was a student at White Plains High School at White Plains, New York. And he said he looked at that letter and it said, "Dear Dr. King, I am a ninth grade student at White Plains High School. And while it should not matter, I would like to mention that I am a white girl. And I read in the paper of your misfortune. I read about your suffering. And I read that if you had sneezed, you would have died. And I'm simply writing to you to say that I'm happy that you didn't sneeze. So I want to say tonight," Dr. King continues, "I'm happy that I didn't sneeze either, because I wouldn't have been around here in 1960 when the students all over the South started sitting in at lunch counters. If I had sneezed, I wouldn't have been around here in 1961 when we decided to take a ride for freedom. And if I had sneezed, I wouldn't have been around here in 1962 when Negroes in Albany, Georgia decided to straighten their backs up. And whenever men and women straighten their backs up, they're going somewhere, because a man can't ride your back unless it is bent. If I had sneezed, I wouldn't have been around here in 1963 when Black people of Birmingham, Alabama aroused the conscience of this nation and brought into being the Civil Rights Act. If I had sneezed, I wouldn't have had a chance that same year to tell America about a dream I had. If I had sneezed, I wouldn't have been down here in Selma, Alabama to see that great movement there. And if I had sneezed, I wouldn't have even been here in Memphis tonight to see this community rally around those brothers and sisters who are suffering. And I'm happy that I didn't sneeze." And they were telling me, now it doesn't matter now. It really doesn't matter what happens now. I left Atlanta this morning, and there were 6 of us. The pilot said over the public address system, "We are sorry for the delay, but we have Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. on the plane. And to be sure that all the bags were checked, be sure that nothing would go wrong on the plane, we had to check out everything. And we had to be very careful. And we have had the plane protected and guarded all night." And then I got to Memphis. And some began to say about the threats, or they talked about the threats that were out about my life. They talked about what would happen to me from some of our sick white brothers. Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead. But it really doesn't matter with me now, because I've been to the mountaintop. And I don't mind like anybody. I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go to the mountain And I looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. And I'm not worried about anything. And I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. The next day, the very next day, April the 4th, 1968, at the Lorraine Motel in downtown Memphis, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., my hero, your mentor, and God's prophet, in room 306 of the Lorraine Motel, Dr. King was preparing to go to dinner with his good friend, the Reverend Billy Samuel Cowles and Reverend Ralph Abernathy, his friend of 14 years, his jail buddy. And as they scurried around room 306, Dr. King asked the philosophical question of the day: where's my pretty necktie that I like to wear when I go to these meetings? Reverend Abernathy said, Martin, it's on the chair where I pressed it for you. And as soon as Dr. King tied his tie, there was a voice outside of 306. It was the voice of the Reverend Jesse Jackson. Reverend Jesse Jackson was out on the lower level of the parking lot. He yelled up to 306, hey, Doc! Hey, Doc! Ben Branch is here. Ben came to serenade you with his new horn. Ben came to play Precious Lord for you. Before Dr. King stepped out on that balcony, he looked to his right. He told his Reverend Ralph Abernathy, I want Ben to play real pretty tonight. Then he looked to his left, told the Reverend Ralph Abernathy, I just want to hear him play Precious Lord for me. And then he stepped out on the balcony. Dr. King never heard one musical note that Ben Branch had prepared for him. He was shot with a 30.06 Game Master rifle. And the bullet was so powerful that it unknotted the tie that Dr. King had just tied. As he lay down on that balcony with a blood-soaked shirt, they rushed him to St. Joseph's Hospital, rushed him to the ER room on a rickety old gurney. Inside that ER room, the first words out of Dr. Rufus Brown and Dr. Ted Gilliam's mouth was tracheotomy. And within minutes, a dozen doctors crowded into that ER room. Neurosurgeon, thoracic surgeon, pulmonary surgeon, hematologist. And for 32 minutes, that team tried to save the life of Dr. King. Finally, about 6:52 p.m. on that fateful night, Dr. Frederick Gioia, a tall Sicilian American, walked over to Reverend Ralph Abernathy and said, he's gone. He said all of his systems have shut down, but his heart is still beating. Reverend Ralph Abernathy said, Doctor, why do you say that's good? Dr. Gioia said, had Dr. King lived, there's a possibility and a probability that he would have been paralyzed from the neck down and in a vegetative state for the rest of his life. And that is not Dr. King. Before Dr. King died, and he died a painful death, He died a useless death. The bullet from that rifle did not kill Dr. King. It was hatred, racism, and man's inhumanity to man that killed Dr. King. Case Western alumni, use your imagination for a minute. I want you to imagine with me that Dr. King invited all of us to hear his last sermon on earth. And we get this special invitation. And he says, as we go into the balcony of the Mason Temple, Church of God in Christ in Memphis. And Dr. King looks up and he said, welcome, Case Western alumni. I'm so glad you could make it because I got a message for you. He said, I was just looking at heaven's internet and I see about the cold weather that you're having there. But remember, God is still in control. I heard about the faulted and the warped leadership that you just got rid of. America does not need to be reborn again, Case Western. America needs to be reborn again. It doesn't need to be great again. It needs to be reborn again. I know about the police brutality from Ferguson to Minneapolis. But nonviolence is still the key to our survival. So, Case Western, my message to you tonight is, everybody can be great because everybody can serve. You don't have to make your subject and your verb agree in order to serve. You don't have to know about Plato and Aristotle to serve. You don't have to know about Einstein's theory of relativity to serve. You don't have to know about the second theory of thermodynamics and physics to serve. You only need a heart full of grace generated by love. Your service to others precedes you, precedes your greatness. So let me just close, please, with an excerpt from a sermon where Dr. King preached his own funeral. He preached his own eulogy 2 months to the exact date of his death. February the 4th, 1968, at the Ebenezer Baptist Church. And he stood up in the pulpit. Historians and sociologists tell me that he was emotional that Sunday, perspiring and crying. And he said in his prophecy, he said, every now and then, I guess we all think realistically about that day when we'll be victimized with what is life found common denominator. And that's something we call death. We all think about it every now and then. I think about my own death. I think about my own funeral. I don't think about it in a morbid sense. And every now and then I ask myself, what is it that I would want them to say? And I'll leave this word with you this morning. If any of you are around when I have to meet my day, I don't want a long funeral. If you get somebody to deliver the eulogy, tell him not to talk too long. And every now and then I wonder what I want him to say. Tell him not to mention that I have a Nobel Peace Prize. That's not important. Tell him not to mention that I have 300 or 400 other awards. That's not important. Tell him not to mention where I went to school. I'd like somebody to say on that day that Martin Luther King Jr. tried to give his life serving others. I'd like somebody to say on that day that Martin Luther King Jr. tried to love somebody. And I want you to say that day that I tried to be right and to walk with them. I want you to be able to say that day that I did try to feed the hungry. And I want you to be able to say that I did try in my life to visit those who were in prison. And I want you to say that I tried to love and serve humanity. Yes, if you want to say that I was a drum major, say that I was a drum major for justice. Say that I was a drum major for peace. I was a drum major for righteousness, and all the other shallow things will not matter. I don't have any fine luxury things to leave to you. But that's all I want to say. That if I can help somebody as I pass along, if I can cheer somebody with a song, if I can show somebody he's traveling wrong, then my living will not be in vain. If I can do my duty as a Christian ought, if I can bring salvation to a world once wrought, and if I can spread the message as the master taught, then my living will not be in vain. So Case Western, tomorrow morning, when you have your first cup of Starbucks, you open your morning newspaper. It could be the Cleveland Plain Dealer or the Akron Beacon Journal. It could be the New York Times or the Detroit Free Press. It might even be the Sacramento Bee or the Boston Globe. It might even be the Pittsburgh Gazette. But whatever newspaper you open, and before you have that sip of coffee, ask yourself, no, tell yourself that if I can help somebody along the way, then my living will not be in vain. God bless you and God keep you, and thank you.
Wow. You can stay on mute and clap. I did a little emoji clap. That was a powerful message, Brother Bozeman.
Amazing. Wow. Amazing.
Wow. I know we have some questions that we're gonna ask. I'll ask the few that were sent in via when people signed up, and then I see we have one here in the chat box. And as we go, if you have questions, please send them. We'll try to get them all answered. You can send them in the chat box. So let me check my questions. I know Crystal just emailed them to me whenever they do come through. So one question, Brother Bozeman, what strategies were used to combat the daily threats to you and other workers in the movement?
Well, when we had demonstration at Alabama State, the only strategy we had was numbers, because we had mass meetings at Hutchinson Street Baptist Church, and naturally the police or the state troopers were not going to protect us. But one of the things that protected us was the sheer numbers of the number of students that participated. If you remember, all of this happened when I was driving, Dr. King, was 3 years after the bus boycott had ended in '58. However, the tension was still there. So there was no kind of self-protection other than numbers, the sheer numbers of all the students and the community in Montgomery to help us along the way. We didn't have private detectives and all of that. So we didn't have any special protection.
Next question. So it's two parts to this question. So the first part is, what was your best experience?
I think the best experience that I had when I saw all of the students at Alabama State marching downtown to integrate the restaurant at the courthouse. I was at the front of the line, me and a few other guys. So I look back, and when I look back, all you could see was students trumping along, going down South Jackson Street toward downtown. And that gave you that kind of instant energy. It gave you the kind of thoughtfulness that I am doing something to change this racist society. I'm doing something that we have read about that needs to be done, and I'm a part of it. That was inspirational to me. Many of Dr. King's speeches also were inspirational to me, because I've heard many sermons, but he was able to put words together that inspire everybody who was sitting in that audience. And that inspiration lingers with me today.
We can tell. Definitely still inspiring. So the second part to that question, Brother Bozeman, do you feel integration has played a success in Black excellence, or do you feel opposed?
Limited. I think integration, as far as equality is concerned, is extremely important. And I'm opposed to any form of segregation, and I'm opposed to any form of racism. But one of the things growing up in Alabama, where I grew up, and I grew up in an all segregated society, one of the things that we had at our Black high schools, we had teachers who cared. We had teachers who loved us. And even at Black colleges like Alabama State, we had professors who worked with you to make sure you didn't fail, because their theme was this: there will be a better day, and we are preparing you for a better day. Integration, yes, but not isolation. So when you encapsulate the kind of love that we had from our Black teachers in high school and our Black college professors, those things pushed us on for us to succeed in an integrated society. And for the sake of repeating myself, I am opposed to any form of racism or segregation.
Okay. So I'm trying to get through these. Just a couple more, and then we'll go to the chat. We're getting a lot. So another question is, how much did you and others involved in the bus protest count on winning a court decision as opposed to negotiating an agreement with the white power structure for better treatment of Black passengers on the buses?
Okay, I was not in the bus boycott, but I was in college after that. Many of my professors at Alabama State were participants, and they taught us the sociological and the historical aspect of the bus boycott. But we did anticipate a favorable court decision, because we had an outstanding federal judge named Frank Johnson, who was very liberal in his thinking, even though he was a Republican. The other thing, what was the other part of the question, was that
how much did you count on winning a court decision as opposed to negotiating an agreement with the white power structure for better treatment of the Black passengers?
Okay, let me talk about the negotiation. The tactics that the Montgomery Bus Company used, they called all of the leadership in, Brian and fellow Americans, and they talked. And that night, they disbanded the meeting because nothing was gained. So the white establishment put out a news clipping that the bus boycott had been settled, and they asked the Black customers to ride the bus. There was a lady on the faculty at Alabama State named Joanne Robinson. She found out that this was untrue, that the bus boycott was continuing, regardless of what the white establishment said. So that night, she went into the Alabama State Library with some students. She jimmied the lock, went into the library, and turned out 10,000 leaflets on the old addresser multigraph machine, gave it to the students. They distributed it to every church, nightclub, house, all over Montgomery, letting us know that that bus boycott wasn't over. And that night, that Monday morning, Dr. King and Mrs. King were sitting in their window, wondering if the Black people were going to ride the bus. And the first bus that passed their house on South Jackson Street, not one single Black person was, and they just cheered. So they broke the back of the bus company by staying together and sticking together and working together to make sure that that we were not going back to segregated seating.
Got you. I know we're running short on time, but we may run a couple minutes over to our audience, but just a heads up. So during the Civil Rights Movement, the Black church played a pivotal part, as you've talked about. What assessment would you give the church's involvement today and why?
The Black church has always played a pivotal and an important role in the Civil Rights Movement. The first mass meeting in Montgomery, after Miss Rosa Parks was arrested, was held at the Holt Street Baptist Church in Montgomery. And it was thundering, and they had a rainstorm that night. And Dr. King said, I know we aren't going to have that many people. And the church was overflowing. So the church became the focal point of the Civil Rights Movement. And all through the movement, we have had the Black church to stand up for righteousness. However, as we now, I see a shift in the Black church, not so much of trying to eradicate segregation per se, because segregation was physical. We could see the signs and the fountains and all of that. But now the Black church needs to take on a new avenue of how to eradicate voter suppression, how to eradicate housing discrimination, how to eradicate justice. And we must do workshops through the church because many of our Black constituents still rely on the church as being the sole messenger of salvation, both here and now. So the Black church is a very important establishment for the continuation of equalizing justice for all of us.
All right. Last one from the one submitted prior to this. Now brace yourself. What do you think Dr. King's response would have been to the insurrection that occurred on January 6th?
You know, I don't like to speak for him, but I don't know what he would say, but I can give you an educated guess. And that is that he would be horrified at what he had seen. Dr. King was a disciple of nonviolence. I remember when Malcolm X had come out with his theory of you hit me, I'll hit you back. And Dr. King told me, said that I have been expecting that, but I am still a nonviolent disciple. So I think that he would be horrified for the January 6th, but he would also castigate those participants and let them know that what they were done did not represent America. But he also would have compared the same kind of insurrection had it been a Black Lives Matter. He would have said, I see a difference in protection. I see a difference in those who are participating. Had they been Black, they would have been killed on the spot. So I think he would have seen a dual kind of equality on each side of the spectrum. But he wouldn't. He would have disapproved of all of that.
All right, now to the chat. So Mr. Malcolm G said he worked with Dr. King and Hosea Williams in Grenada, Mississippi in 1966, 1 year after graduating from Case. He has seen far too little change in making progress in racial and economic justice. So his question is, how can we change that now that Democrats control the presidency and both houses of Congress? So that's the first part of the question. How can we change that now that the Democrats control the presidency in both houses of Congress, how can we change it? Like, how can we make more progress in racial and economic justice? Because he hasn't seen much since the 60s.
We must be careful to distinguish between progress and change. Progress in racial relations is getting from point A to point B, taking the signs down, riding in front of the bus. But change is systemic. When you get Black people, African American, on the board of directors of American Express, on the board of directors of major corporations, so they can change the core of acceptance of Black people. College professors, deans at white schools ought to be vice presidents and not in that little box of being inclusion or diversity. They must be in the forefront of change where they can make decisions that will systemically change all of the relationships between Black and white, not just be happy with little tidwinks of progress of moving from A to B. Oh, well, we got a Black this or the first Black that did this. That's inconsequential now. We need Black systemic change makers, change agents that reaches to the core of our society.
And so the very last part of his question, I didn't want to give them both to you because it's a lot. How can we get white Americans to understand how holding back people of color hurts our nation terribly and must stop?
We have to establish a quality dialogue between white American and Black America. White America must, the color of your skin in America denotes how white America treats you. America has gospelized, they have canonized the color of your skin. So that is a psychological barrier right there. So we must learn, we must teach white America through dialogue, meaningful dialogue, that we aspire to be the same kind of individuals where we can care for our families and we work hard and that we are not subhuman. So we have to, but they have to also see that Black America is not the problem. It's white America who accept us as the problem. The 14th Amendment of the Constitution said all persons born or naturalized in the United States are citizens of the United States or the state in which they reside. But the key to that is that no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of a citizen of the United States. That gives us key to being an equal citizen. So we must let white America know that we are citizens and that they must accept us no matter what the consequences are.
I'm gonna let Sharice kind of jump in. I know it was some questions sent to her as well.
Okay.
So, hello, Mr. Bozeman.
Hi, how are you?
I'm great. Just enjoying this presentation along with everyone else who's in attendance. Before I ask the first question that I have in the chat, we're at 7:01 right now, so we're officially a minute past our scheduled end time, but there seems to be a lot of interest in what you have to say and your opinion on a lot of the issues of the day and some of the historical pieces that you're able to share with us. If you are in agreement with pushing forward, I would love to continue to ask you some of those questions as we record, and those who are not able to stay on, feel free to disconnect. We'll make sure those recordings go out to everyone. And when we get to the point where you feel like you just it's been a little bit taxing and you need to wind down, we will make arrangements and follow up with you to see if we can answer.
I'm fine.
All right. So as long as you're fine, we're going to keep on pressing forward. Thank you so much for your flexibility.
No problem.
The first question that I have is, who do you see as current civil rights leaders?
Black America doesn't have any civil rights leaders now like we did during the early King era. We have, because our demographics have changed so widely now, that one leader cannot sustain Black America now. What we have, as I call them, constitutional consultants, men and women who have done research and gathered data on what America needs to share with us in order for us to progress as a race. I've often had, Sharice, I've often had the discussion about whether Dr. King should have started economically to tackle racism, or whether he should have changed socially. And my answer to that is that Dr. King and his cohorts tackled the physical aspects of segregation. At that time, the physical aspects were sitting in the back of the bus, separate water fountains, separate bathroom, white only, colored only. He changed that because it was physical and it was what was needed at the time. But as progress moved on, economics became the important aspect. To answer your question, I don't think that we can settle now with one civil rights leader. I think groups like the Black Lives Matter or other NAACP, the Legal Fund, all of these are working together to foster equality and justice for us. But just to have one individual, I don't think it's feasible now, simply because of the demographics.
Thank you so much. Our next participant is interested in knowing if you can tell us how you would describe the climate of a college campus during the civil rights movement.
If you were talking about the Black college campuses, they were an upheaval during the 60s. There was not a Black college campus that was at peace and goodwill. Alabama State was in upheaval, and Governor Patterson threatened to shut it down. Tougaloo College was in upheaval. I was on a panel discussion not too long ago at the Underground Railroad Museum, and Dr. Joyce Ladner, who was interim president of Howard, was on we were on a panel together, and she said at Tougaloo that she was out demonstrating. All of the students were. They shut it down, and she was arrested. She was running from a mob who had sticks and bricks, and there was a white lady on the front porch, and there was a hole in the curtain, and she said, come on in, child. Said, white folks shouldn't be treating y'all like this. And she says to this day, she feels it bothers her because of that. So every college campus was in turmoil in the 60s. White colleges had begun, with the limited number of Black students, had begun to unravel. But now I get a different feeling when I go to Alabama. I know the history of the University of Alabama. I know the history of University of Mississippi. I know the history of Georgia. And I know all of the students who tried to get in and how they were turned away and they were beaten. So it doesn't enlighten my spirit when I go to Alabama now and see Roll Tide. It doesn't. I like to see Alabama State. That's all I'm interested in. And I know that's a selfish and biased country, but it's because of the history of those schools. So the college campuses were all during the 60s were in an uproar. And in the South, they were threatened to shut down because go back to Alabama State, Governor Patterson told President Trenum, if you don't get rid of those 9 troublemakers that went down to the courthouse initially, I'll shut it down. He said, well, I don't have any place for 3,000 students to go. I don't care. Get rid of the 9. And he had to dismiss the first 9 students, expelled, who were later given their degrees later. Uproar everywhere.
Thank you.
All right, so we're gonna be going back and forth to finish these questions. I only have 2 more from the chat. Just so one question, you kind of alluded to it, Brother Bozeman. How do you view the leadership in the Black community since April 4th, 1968? I guess from then till now, how do you view the leadership in the Black community?
Well, up until April the 4th, Dr. King was the leader. And if you remember, after that, they tried to get Reverend Ralph Abernathy to lead. He wasn't that successful because there was infighting. Then the Mrs. King stepped in, and she wasn't that successful. So there was a shifting in Black leadership from April the 4th until now. So leadership changed because the demographics changed. And one of the demographics that changed was that Black students who were admitted to Black colleges and other colleges, they began to get jobs in white corporate America. That changed the demographics a lot. So leadership became sparse. So now we have leaders, but they are sliced into different segments. We have leaders in higher education. We have leaders in corporate America. We have leaders all in different segments of our Black society. So the leadership has been warped to the fact that we don't have one kingmaker like we had before. And on certain aspects, I think that's good because we have changed so much since April the 4th, 1968.
All right, and the last question I have for the chat before I give it back to Sharice. Were you ever late picking up Dr. King?
Yes, I was. And he got real, he got a little teed off at me. Started to say something. We had a military operation the way that we had it. What I would do is go pick up the station wagon at that time. It was not an SUV, but I would go pick up the car in the morning. I would take my Alabama State students to church, my community people to the church, and my senior citizen. Dr. King would drive the personal family car, an old blue Pontiac. So, but it would reverse itself after 11 o'clock services. Mrs. King would take the personal car to bring the kids back home, and I would go and deliver my clients and come back to the church and pick up Dr. King. But once I went to the dorm and I fell asleep, and Dr. King was waiting for me at the church, and I was fast asleep. So later on, there was a knock at my dormitory door. And Dr. King said to me, "Mr. Bozeman, would you please give me my keys?" And he was teed off. And I thought he was going to fire me, but he never mentioned the incident again. That's the only time I was late. I really felt bad about it.
All right, Sharice, back to you.
Okay. You still feeling okay to proceed?
Go ahead. No, I'm good.
As a civil rights leader, what advice would you give today's youth that seem to be so focused on the social media craze?
I want my youth to read Black history. I want my youth to study Black history. I want them to know the contributions that many who have gone on before them, who have laid the groundwork for them to be where they are today. I want them to know that there were Black men and women who gave their lives for them to be where they are today. I've had questions from youth in speaking engagements all over. And they have asked me questions like, was Selma real? Because I've only seen snippets of on TV, Mr. Bo. Was that a real episode, the Selma Bridge? They have asked me, who was Joe Louis? They have asked me questions that you and I normally just take for granted that they know. But if you don't read and study your history, then other people can write it for you and omit all of the accomplishments that we have made. So the first thing I want my youth to do is read and study Black history, henceforth, now and forevermore. There are enough Black books on the market this day for them to become acquainted with Dr. John Hope Franklin, with Johnny Cochran. There's enough books on the market now for them to know what those people went through for them to be where they are. And see, they have a sense of entitlement now. And it was not given to them on a silver platter. It was given to them through sweat and blood. Read, read, read.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to do 2 more questions, and then we will connect with you to see if there's a way that we can possibly get the answers to the other questions to appear in one of our upcoming newsletters.
Okay.
So, what effective roles did African American fraternities and sororities play in the movement for civil rights along with Dr. King?
Well, Dr. King was an alpha, and I don't hold that against him. But strangely enough, sororities and fraternities paved the way for some of us to get ahead in jobs that was previously closed to us. So it was, we had an alpha brother or kappa brother who was in a position to help us, he was there to pull us up along the way. So fraternities and sororities played a very active role in the civil rights movement because they paved the way for us to be at where we are today. However, when the job market opened up and quite a few Black kids was in corporate America, the role of sororities and fraternities diminished because they didn't feel that they needed them like we did. We needed them for our self-fulfillment to get ahead in life. They feel that they don't need it now. But I beg to differ with them because as part of sororities and fraternities can show how brotherhood, sisterhood can foster and engender a love for each other that goes far beyond corporate America. And we can pick up the phone 20 years from now and call brothers that we know. And just to see how they are, because we have engendered their love and their understanding.
Okay, thank you again. Okay, so this will be our final question of the evening. Thank you everyone for hanging in there. So during your travels through Alabama in the 60s, did you run across any lynchings? If not, did Dr. King discuss this topic while traveling across the country?
I didn't run into any lynching, but since you brought it up there, I have visited the Memorial Museum in Montgomery that's dedicated to lynching. And I'd urge all of you to go and see it. It's heart-wrenching. No, I didn't see any lynching. Dr. King didn't discuss that with you. But I've taken it upon myself very quickly to study lynchings in America. From 1868 to 1968, there were over 4,200 lynchings in America. every state had at least one lynching, but Idaho and Oregon, I think. But I was surprised to find that there was a lynching in Duluth, Minnesota, where 3 Black circus workers were lynched because they had been accused of molesting a white girl. And later on, they found out that it was untrue. But as they dragged those 3 men out of their cell in Duluth, Minnesota, they threw 3 ropes across a lamppost on 6th Avenue and 13th Street in Duluth. And as their bodies were swinging in the wind, they said they didn't do it. And one of the guys blurted out with the N-word. They was just N-words anyway. So what's the difference? 2002, Duluth saw that it had done wrong. And they got a memorial for those 3 Black men, Roustabout, who is looking toward those lampposts and pointing because they were lynched. So lynching was nasty. Billie Holiday talked about it in Strange Fruit. In the song that she said, lynching has been, we couldn't breathe. We couldn't say, our voice had to be certain level before we could talk to white people without being lynched, especially Black men. And that's what they taught us in the South about survival. Our moms and dad taught us not only to read and write, but how to survive in a white society in the South with us growing up. So yes, lynching was nasty, and it should be studied. So all of you go to that museum in Montgomery, please, and you will be touched. And as they say in Alabama, you'll be touched. Please, please.
Right. So as we get ready to close this out, again, I just want to thank you all for being a part of this event. We appreciate you. Special thank you to our guest of honor, Brother Clarence Bozeman, Mr. Clarence Bozeman, to everyone else. So just moving forward, you could join us for Profiles of Inclusive Excellence, which is a week from today on February 25th. That'll be with Dr. Cassie Pittman-Clater. And be sure to like and follow the African American Alumni Association on Facebook. Brother Bozeman, I truly appreciate you. Your inspiration to us all. I thank you for doing this. We probably all learned something new today that we didn't know, and you've definitely served and touched us. So tomorrow we will wake up and try to do the same. I would be remiss if I didn't give our president, Ms. Vera Perkins Hughes, a chance if you have any closing remarks that you wanted to give or anything you wanted to say.
Thank you, Brian. And thank you, Mr. Bozeman. I got to talk to you a minute or so before you began, but this was an excellent presentation. I like that you brought in the historical pieces from Dr. King. And I think his life and legacy is something that we all have heard about. But tonight, I think your passion that you spoke with rekindled some of the excitement around Dr. Martin Luther King. And having an opportunity to be in SCLC in Atlanta, as I spoke to you earlier, in the 1970s, it was interesting to me coming from the North and going to Atlanta, how the SCLC movement under Reverend Abernathy and John Lowry, Joseph Lowry, how it did change. But the impact, we still feel it today. And we appreciate your historical perspective on even researching the lynching, and it lets us know that you are a student of that era, but applying it today. Black Lives Matter. We've been watching the Black Church the last 2 nights. So I think this was timely, Brian, and I'm sure everyone enjoyed you. Thank you for your time and your thoughtful answers to these kind of difficult questions, actually. But it is important for our young people to know our history and to write our own history. Otherwise, somebody else will certainly do that. So thank you again.